good to be here. I've just left this building. Actually, we've got a lovely new building as well, so another one on the other side of the river, and it's nice to come back to sort of the mothership, if you like. Now, I'm going to try and kick off the discussions with a few facts and figures. I know issues in sport and sports marketing and sponsorship in specifically are not all black and white, but hopefully you would expect professional services firm like PwC to throw a few facts and figures at you. So I'm firstly going to consider some of the, just very, very high level, I promise you, some of the economic trends which impact on the global sports industry. And then I'm specifically going to look at some issues around sponsorship. So I know one element of sports marketing, and particularly look at some of the emerging trends in sponsorship. And really just trying to draw on some of the examples that I've had from the work that I do with sports clubs, governing bodies and the public sector. So I promise you this is the only economic slide, but I quite like it. We call it the economic weather map. And it really, the importance of it really is just, obviously the economy impacts on sports spend. Largely because sports spend is related to disposable income, but also obviously the state of the economy is impacted on corporates as well, and corporate spend, both in terms of corporate hospitality obviously, and then also sponsorship and media spend. So I think it's really important to just understand what's happening to the wider world, and you'll see the relevance as we go through the presentation. One interesting point I would say is that gradually as economies mature, I think spend on sport, spend on leisure and entertainment becomes less of a sort of frivolous spend and more of an essential spend. And I certainly think as we've gone through the economy here in the UK, if you look at some of the spend on season tickets and spend which I think people now consider as essential spend, you'll see less of an impact on the recession. Merchandising, yes, you've seen some impact. Corporate hospitality, definitely you've seen some impact, but I think it is interesting. I think that core spend is holding up. Now what this chart is showing is the red figures here is GDP growth. This is increase in consumer sort of inflation, and then this is trying to give the overview of the outlook, the weather outlook. So the countries with a stormy future in the short term include, as you'd expect, Ireland and Spain. Those with slightly stronger growth are Germany, US, Canada. And then the strongest economies are really the BRIC countries, Brazil, India, China, and Russia. But what do those economic trends mean for the global sports market? Well, there are two main drivers, I think, of sports revenues. Firstly, the economy, but then also major sports events. They can have quite an impact on trends. Although, I would say that the main block is really those are the ongoing sports events, so that's really what's generated by the economy. And these tiny little bits at the top are actually the additional revenue that's really generated by the major sports events. So I think it does put those major sports events into context. I mean, the core sports business is absolutely massive, worth $114 billion in 2009. And what this is really trying to show, this is from a publication we produced last year. Some of you may have seen it. It's called Back on Track. It's part of the suite of publications we produce in terms of entertainment and media outlook. Copies are on the website, or give me your business card and I'll send you a copy. But it's really trying to look at the global trends in sport. What this is showing is that there was very strong growth in sports revenue since 2004, growth of about 4.4% until about 2009. But going forward, it's still going to be strong growth, but not quite as high at 3.9%, which again, you would probably expect because of the impact of the recession. The strongest growth, we think, will continue in EMEA, but also there's going to be greater growth in Latin America. USA, which is a very mature market, is going to be slightly less growth. And then I'm just going to turn specifically to sponsorship. Actually, gate revenues are the biggest source of sports revenues. It's about 38% of the total. But sponsorship is the next largest sector. It's 26% of the total spend in sport. And this table just looks at some of the sort of key data. And I think what this also shows is, and what I was trying to look at, is what has been the impact of the recession on sponsorship. And I think it very clearly shows in 2009 there clearly was a little bit of a dip, and we're starting to see a recovery in 2010. What I think is particularly interesting is that we're seeing quite a lot of growth in the larger sponsorship deals, so those deals of more than $100 million. And I think that latter point is key, because it's, my contention is that all the way through the recession, it's actually exacerbated a trend that we were already seeing. So there's been increased polarization between the really strong brands with a global reach and then the smaller sports brands. And therefore, during the recession, we've seen some unbelievable deals by Man United, Liverpool, and shirt deals with, really massive increases on previous deals. But another key trend during the recession is we had a little bit of a change in terms of the type of sponsors. So although beer and sports clothing have always been sort of big sponsors of the industry, cars and banking really dropped in 2008, 2009. Again, you probably wouldn't, you'd expect that, but we have seen a growth again. So I think the number of deals now by banks or by car manufacturers has increased, and there's a number of examples. So these charts then start to drill down a little bit in terms of market share. I won't go into too much detail, but I think what's interesting is that Asia Pacific, for example, accounts for more than its fair share in terms of the sponsorship market. So in terms of sponsorship of the global sponsorship pie, Asia Pacific accounts for about 25% of the total. In terms of the global sports market, it's 15%. Which I think is just showing how important sponsorship and media revenues are to sport in Asia Pacific. And that's really because gate revenues is actually relatively less important in those regions. And then the table is really showing that growth rates were just starting to pick up in 2010, but our forecast is that there's going to be further growth in this area. And actually, sponsorship is the fastest growing sector in terms of sports revenues. I referred to those economies that were really growing, and that is becoming so key in terms of sports sponsorship. So certainly the BRIC economies, as they're growing in importance, we're seeing an increasing number of sponsorship deals in sport from corporates in the BRIC economies and other emerging economies, because they're trying to use sport to really to get themselves onto the global stage. So actually in 2010, BRIC countries accounted for 12 of the biggest 50 sponsorship deals. I mean, US still dominates, but I think the emergence of these new corporates is a really important trend that we're seeing. Now, clearly it's helped by Brazil being the venue for the next World Cup, for Sochi being the next venue for the Winter Games, and certainly you can distinguish those deals in there. But I think it's a clear trend, and something to certainly our sports clients are very much looking to those countries as potential opportunities in terms of sponsorship partners. So not only do we have new sponsors coming into the market, but we're also seeing sponsors are definitely changing behaviours in terms of how they want to associate themselves with sports. Now, I think some of these topics some of my colleagues may look at in more detail, so I'm just going to touch on them. And so the first one, I suppose, is really, this is it's actually a study done by Sport Business, and what it's showing is that online and social media is cited as being one of the, or the biggest, largest growing area. I was actually quite surprised that broadcast advertising is still seen as such a large growth area, but that might just be a reflection of when the survey was done. So it's reflecting the fact that obviously advertising had such a bad time, that this was, a point of where growth was continuing again. And then the other sort of small amount of statistics I wanted just to share with you was, again, the same Sport Business survey. We're asking sponsors what features were particularly important about sports properties. So what from a marketing point of view, what does sport really give you? 38% cited global reach, which I think is, reflective of the point I made earlier about the biggest sports brands find it easier to attract sponsors. But interesting, 27% cited connection with athletes, and that's something I'm very much seeing. So I was talking to one of the Premier League clubs recently, and they were saying, they are really targeting a step change in sponsorship revenue. And they said to do that, they know what they need to do is bring the manager and the players along with them. So they've actually got to change contracts, they've got to change the philosophy of the whole club. It's not something the marketing director can do on his own. It needs to involve the whole club. And they recognise that to achieve that step change, they need to do that. I must admit I was slightly surprised how small the CSR and community reach was as a proportion. Because I think there are lots of very good examples of sponsors who are looking at sport as a way of fulfilling some of their CSR agendas. So that's really all I wanted to say as a quick start on the subject. It's such a massive subject, and we're going to delve into some of these topics, but I think hopefully that's a useful start, and let's move on to some much more exciting slides by my colleagues.